Welcome to the UnityNow podcast, where we discuss unity in the face of division. Stemming from the Unity 2020 plan, we explore how to bring unity to America and end the dysfunctional and destructive Republican-Democrat duopoly. UnityNow is 100% volunteer-run and supports the Unity movement at articlesofunity.org.
Howdy. I'm Gabe Garber. Welcome back to UnityNow podcast. I'm joined today by Cactus Chu, a mathematician, political commentator, and host of the Metapolitics podcast, a place to learn all things about irrational politics. Welcome, Cactus. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, we are excited to have you. I've been kind of digging through and going back through listening to the Metapol podcast and really have found so much value there. I think you're hitting on very important and valuable concepts and ideas, and yeah, we're happy to have you on, hoping to spread some of your word to a larger audience and hoping to maybe point them in that direction. But in place of that, for the time being, we'll maybe just kind of do an overview of some of the stuff that you're focused on and care the most about. So I don't know if I obviously gave a little bit of a potted bio of you, but is there anything else that you would like to hit on and let us know about yourself before we get going?
Absolutely. I came to politics for essentially the sole reason that research papers, particularly ones related to politics, don't get read. You push a research paper, it gets like 5 views. And podcasting is really the medium for intellectual development, in my opinion. So much of what I talk about forms arcs. So I started off by talking about political dynamics and elections, moved from there to talking about corruption, and really started laying the groundwork for what would become metapolitics now, which is a concise breakdown of all of the irrational areas, of the dark places, of the intersection of the human mind and politics, and understanding how to actually navigate that place for us. And then now I'm starting with a project that I think is the right way to attack many of the political problems that exist right now. That's the new arc of metapolitics, which now is centered on two core ideas. One is network effects, the ability for various social networks to grow and to grow exponentially, leveraging some of those psychological flaws I talk about on the podcast. This means that the number of people who would be affected by a given ideology, by a given political movement, by a given conspiracy theory, grows dependent on the number of people who currently believe that idea. Now, people who know a bit of mathematics will know that this is exponential, which means that it grows essentially multiplying by one step each time. So if you consider the parable of the rabbit, where you have two rabbits on an island, and then each pair of rabbits produces two children. On the first day you have 2, on the next you have 4, and then 8, and so on. Now, it may seem like there would be a small number of rabbits for a long time. You don't have to worry about them. It only starts with 2. But with exponential growth, within 10 days you have 1,000. Within 20 you have 1,000,000. And you've probably run out of resources on the island by now. So that's the scale at which we're dealing with. And when you have network effects, particularly hyper-connected ones, like you see in social media, then every generation is one reshare. Every development of an ideology, every change in one given conspiracy theory or one given false idea, that's constantly being shared. All it takes is not a day, like the rabbits, but really a few seconds. So that's the growth we're dealing with. That's how small things can rapidly get out of hand and create mass delusions in politics. And that's exactly why we need to take a look at this with a much higher scale than we normally do.
Yeah.
I think there was some physicist, I forget his name, who said that the best time to do something is the last moment. But the trick is knowing when that last moment is. And I think when you've seen a lot of the skepticism towards threats towards our democracy, a lot of the skepticism towards the danger of, quite frankly, a small number of people who are absolutely delusional in our politics, they're overlooking a lot of the fundamental dynamics that have changed from now compared to 2000. And that's exactly what I'm trying to cover and what I'm trying to spread awareness for with the pod.
Great. I mean, yeah, plenty of that sounds, especially with dealing with awareness of corruption and just finding new ways to look at what we're dealing with and coming to terms with that, ties in plenty with, like I said, I think the Unity movement in general, or what at least got that started, was offering a new, fresh perspective on facing up against that Goliath of the political machine that is in front of us. Was that something? Yeah. How are you? Were you aware? Were you involved, like, with the Unity movement? How did you kind of find that, or come to be involved?
Absolutely. I saw about Unity very early, and quite frankly, with the slate of political candidates at the time, I think it was only second nature to want some sort of alternative. So I would call myself an early adopter.
Yeah. And I think...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it seemed like maybe the initial episodes of Metapol started a little bit before the movement was born, but it seemed like, again, you were taking notice of what was going on and recognizing a gap in some of the narratives and the media coverage of everything, and starting to understand, like you said, the how the network effects were spreading and strengthening these arguments for making the case for things that weren't necessarily solving or attempting to solve problems that we're up against.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what the Unity movement really gets right is that the role of the people isn't necessarily to be the policy analysts, to be the 300 IQ administrators that either media or political movements kind of suggest them to be. The core power of the people is a veto. Its ability to say, F this stuff, and say, we're going to go with some other alternative, regardless of what the circumstances are, because there is simply no trust. And that's fundamentally something that keeps the entire system of government in check. If you're going to ask the voters to do an incredibly difficult task, that isn't going to be feasible. Quite frankly, people have full-time jobs to do, and that's perfectly understandable, and electoral systems were built around this. Now, it seems completely inconsistent with the politics that we have today, because there seems to be a decision that requires all of this knowledge about healthcare, all of this knowledge about economics, all this knowledge about policing, etc. And there's a false binary that's put into place, which is either you think that people should be more involved in politics, or you think that they don't and you're quote-unquote autocratic. And both of those things miss the core exchange that's happening. The exchange is between a voter's time and the value they get out of government. And in fact, the best model, and what the historical model of government, particularly in the United States, is that of a veto. Is that of politicians, personally and in parties, essentially having a brand. That brand has a level of trust. And if that trust runs out, if they keep making mistakes, if they keep breaking promises, then voters simply will never elect that politician ever again. And in fact, the core appeal was either someone who had that positive track record, or in lieu of that, someone completely random, a citizen politician. Now, we've somehow been tricked into believing that veto no longer exists, that there isn't an ability to just shut everything down and to close off all of this opening towards either of the two political parties. And any kind of method that offers an alternative is the way out here, is the way to reactivate that cheap but incredibly effective way of keeping politicians in line.
Yeah. Well, I think the trust element there and drawing the comparison between a brand essentially and a brand being something that is only as good as the trust in it. I think that really sums it up nicely, because it does seem like both parties at this point, and it's been the same way marching over time. Like we've come to this point through several iterations and moving in a direction of just kind of a building lack of trust that's accumulated without maybe a proper or an acceptable release valve in terms of that building lack of trust.
Well, here's the reason why that is. It's because having a trusting coalition actually serving the people in the current political circumstances is impossible. And there's been talk of a coming realignment. I don't think it's likely. But let's go through a history lesson to talk about why this might be so necessary. So there's this political scientist, and unlike many political theories, he actually supplies a lot of data to back it up, named Charles Lubell, where he talks about the sun and moon theory of politics. Essentially, it states that there's always going to be a dominant party most of the time, and that the other party is essentially playing catch-up. It's reacting to that party, it's shifting in different ways, either trying to compromise or as a reactionary party taking advantage of the previous leader's mistakes or other sorts of personal flaws. Well, what new modern political scientists have described now is that there are two moon parties. Both parties are driven by that reactionary strain. They're driven by the hatred of the opposition. Now, this is not the first time this has happened in the past. For example, you can consider the era post-FDR to be some manifestation of this, where there was more of a consensus towards pushing economic progressivism, and one party all but died off, and the other really struggled to have moving forward in a coherent direction. Of course, they were still winning based on the back of FDR. However, there was a series of essentially decoherences where they didn't necessarily connect to the same moral appeals that brought them into office in the first place. Now, with regards to the current political parties, I think due to various network effects, as I talked about before, due to self-sorting in social media based on groups of friends, as well as based on geographic sorting and degree sorting, you have a phenomenon where people who fundamentally hold conservative moral priorities are in the Democratic Party, and vice versa. And if you actually look at analyses of this, such as in Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, there are a significant contingent of the Democratic Party who are very highly authoritarian, who are very highly based in purity, people who we would generally consider to be social conservatives, and these tend to be culturally far left. Similarly, on the right, you have reactionaries, you have free speech absolutists, people who are very preoccupied with ideas of liberty, ideas of fairness, ideas of openness that you would never see on the political right historically. These, maybe you would consider them libertarians or third way Republicans, right?
Yeah.
And so what you see is a period of extended decoherence, a period where both of the parties don't have an affirmative message. They don't have a way to sell a set of policies that connect to these moral values. Because regardless of what policy they sell, there's going to be a fracturing of the party. Now, there are two ways to serve your political coalition. One is to make those moral appeals. You have a limited number of resources, and if they're allocated to some moral goals, then you're going to have a beneficial realignment to those people. The other is to grab power. Now, in times of economic prosperity, this can be done just by economic growth, but that's not the times we're living in. So, what is actually being done is that there's a necessity to grab power from the opposition side, to say, look, here are the coalitions. This team is Republican, this team is Democratic. And since we have no fundamental ability to shift things based on morality, we're going to shift things based on resources, and we're going to engage in wealth transfers from one side to the other. And that's in fact what both parties have been attempting now. And who gets caught up in all of this is that actually all people are going to be suffering because there's no productive coherence, there's no actual connection to any sort of decency, to any sort of morality, and you get exactly what we see with increasing corruption, increasing manipulation of the media, and increasing disrespect for all facets of American life.
Yeah, it's a bit unnerving and unsettling to say the least. And again, like just tying it back in with the Unity movement, I think that was something that was, and you hit on this, was like very early on, quite apparent that you know, this was this group of people who kind of spelled that out in no uncertain terms, that in a way that hadn't been pointed at in such a way, and kind of just a resistance or a, like you said, a veto, just saying we've had enough of this. This is not serving anyone, regardless of how you might identify politically. There's, you know, the disrespect coming from either party, or just they're caught up in their own affairs, making sure that they're just kind of playing the game amongst themselves, and without very much substantial interest in creating policies that serve the population of the country. I know that might tie into obviously some of the network effects you were saying. It's an easy thing to just say, well, one of the solutions is for us to just abandon social media, but I know you tend to advocate for trying to, or I guess maybe a need to utilize the power of those network effects of the tools that we have in order to build stronger, more meaningful, substantive coalitions that actually aim to address the root problems that we're facing. Could you maybe, is there anything there that you might flesh out in terms of how we might, not weaponize, that's too strong of a word, but how we might utilize the...
No, I'm down with weaponize. So, cool. Why we're living in this extended period of decoherence is because that more has been on the table than ever before. You have people who genuinely believe in conspiracy theories, like racial conspiracies, like QAnon, and like other election-related conspiracy theories, etc. And this isn't because there's a fundamental difference in human nature. It's because there's a fundamental difference in the tools that can be used to manipulate it. And quite frankly, this is something that I have significant issue with essentially everyone who has tried to combat this so far. There's not an awareness that all of the cards are on the table yet. There's not an awareness that these things are not just normal politics. The ability to create an undying trust based on stories that are completely fictional is a new dawn. It is something that is completely different from anything that we have experienced before. And let me just give a quick example to flesh this out. If you're someone who's living in a QAnon filter bubble, a social media environment where all of your friends are posting QAnon content, all of the people who you know are kind of reaffirming this, then what you're seeing is a completely different world. Just imagine this. You wake up, you go talk to your friends online, and they post a story about a pedophile abusing children and getting away with it for several years. Then you scroll down, a few minutes later, you see another story this time about another case of child abuse, maybe one where the police didn't do their due diligence. Now, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of stories like this across the United States every single day. And that's not because of a conspiracy theory. It's because there's 330 million of us. When you get to numbers of that scale, then of course you're going to see several dozen criminals, crazy people, who are committing atrocious acts. But because you have that constant stream of information, you see that as your everyday. You feel like that is something that is surrounding you. You just wake up day and night. All of the time you're seeing stories about pedophiles. All of the time. Constantly being covered in what is your news environment are these QAnon-related stories. And when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your coworkers who aren't necessarily involved with this, it seems like they're completely blind to this. So how do people settle that contradiction? The logical way to settle it is, as I talked about before, there are 330 million of us. And when you magnify the worst things that happen, then there can be a constant stream of individual stories of specific cases just by sheer volume. However, how they settle it is that because this isn't getting mainstream coverage, because they seemingly live in a world where this is a constant threat and the most impending danger, then they feel like there's a conspiracy against them. Now, it's only so far that you don't have to take that very far in order to look at what's happening with regards to police shootings, with regards to certain types of really individual stories, individual cases that are constantly being covered and do cause very real harms and very real conspiracy beliefs with regards to people who believe in far left politics as well. When you have a conspiracy theory that uses these individual examples to string together a fictitious story about mass racism in the United States, then you get people refusing to take the COVID vaccine because of perceived racism, for example. You get very real dangers. And this isn't to downplay the dangers of conspiracy theorists on the right either. This is something that is completely novel. This is something that the entire deck needs to be taken in order to deal with. And quite frankly, with regards to many of the people who are centrists, or I don't think that's a good word either, who are third way, who oppose the far left and the far right, they tend to be liberals who have a lot of restraining principles. They tend to be incredibly risk averse. And because of this, they're not willing to engage with the full force that is necessary because of this. So I don't like giving problems without solutions. So here's a solution. And there is real reason to be optimistic here. Some of these mass delusions can in fact be used for good. I think there is a strong factual case for belief in climate change and for belief that climate change should be taken much more seriously than it is now. However, many of the people who are the most extreme activists, the Extinction Rebellion folks, etc., they don't actually look at the research. They're completely driven by emotional appeals, by some of those moral ideas, such as authority, to people who have told them about this grave threat that is happening in their lives. Now, that grave threat is real. However, their activism, their irrational kind of constant obsession with promoting something is something that is driven by these narratives and not actually by the underlying reality. However, my contention is that particularly compared to the status quo, this is fine. I'm fine with having a bunch of delusional people dealing with something just because of a story, as long as that thing is rooted in truth originally. Because of the stakes that are at play here, and because this information technology, this information manipulation is only getting more well understood by the people who already are making attempts to affect this, we, normal people who have actual goals to verify, who want to make decisions based off of evidence, have to be willing to take that step of contributing towards various, what I call pathologens, which are a combination of pathologies and pathogens, which are ideas with two characteristics. One, that they're contagious, that they can spread from person to person through some manner. And two, that they're compulsive. They create an obsessive or irrational belief in something, and they create incentives for people to do things that they otherwise would not do rationally. And so you have pathologens being used, yes, in the case of racial conspiracy theories, and yes, in the case of QAnon, but also in the case of climate activism to do what I think and what various data and verifiable things you can collect show are also in alignment with a good endpoint. So what I see as a way out of this is that we engage in a new psyop. We engage in an active attempt to look at these phenomena that are taking place, to understand them, and to go one step further than what lowercase l liberals do, is to accept that these exponential growths are going to occur, that they're going to be dominant in politics from now on, and that lowercase l liberals need to take up the mantle and need to start their own pathologens, appealing to these various ley lines, appealing to these psychological flaws that will restore good policy, not through some kind of idealistic return to absolute free speech, some kind of idealistic moral appeal, standing up for something, but no, through fighting dirty and through using the exact same, not necessarily the exact same tactics, but using tactics that are based in, yes, psychological manipulation. But that is going to be what the status quo is no matter what. A good friend of mine once told me that the way you know when an idea is good is when every single criticism of it is a description of the status quo. And that's exactly the mindset we need to have, not a mindset of fear, but a mindset of dedicated investigation and dedicated application.
Yeah. Well, I think some of what you were saying there too wrapped back into that the moon, having two moon parties, with the reactiveness coming from both of them, and how the tendency more and more has become to, we're not voting necessarily for someone, but rather against the other person, and just that tendency to, when it comes to the conspiracy theories, if there's almost an overreaction of saying, for someone to say that's not true at all when they're faced with some information, and like you're saying, with a population as big as it is, the starting point shouldn't necessarily be complete denial that what people are focused on is true, or complete denial that it's true. It should be, there's a place to start that can recognize that, yes, the thing that you're concerned with may be happening and is happening, but where do we go from there? The extent to which the focus is there should allow maybe more ground for us to have conversations and address the issues, as opposed to starting from, you're saying this is a rampant issue and I'm saying that's not an issue at all. It's I don't know, that's basically not taking any, not removing anything from a real conversation. Where if that's all the conversation we're having is yes or no on the very extremes, like everything else, reality is still happening within a much broader middle ground there, that if instead of opposing the conspiracy claims, there's, like I said, a recognition that there might be a seed of truth to that, but the reaction to it tends to be maybe more of an oversimplification down to reducing something to not happening at all, or not being the case at all. I think the stickiness of the pathologens that you're talking about makes it to where it's really hard to escape them. But I think, like you're saying, maybe harnessing some of the power of that and finding a way to use those to shape solutions potentially. I don't know if you maybe have any more like suggestions there to shape that and move the conversation regarding solutions forward, and if there are other examples there, I guess, of pathologens or ideas that you might have of how to maybe craft some that are just as engaging, just as sticky and what's the word that you've said, contagious and compulsive, or leading to compulsive behavior. If there are any ways that we might shape those intentionally in a way that is aimed towards something more representative of the whole picture.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I want to make as clear as possible is that many of these people are beyond dialogue. I've personally spent some time in both far left and far right conspiratorial circles as part of the research for the podcast. The weak version of this claim is that it's not worth spending your time on these types of people. And quite frankly, I don't think that these people are going to be reached even if we try to make such a concentrated approach. Is such a kind of dedicated approach towards having a dialogue with them. Fundamentally, there are two things that can be done. One is to make a various pathogen that appeals to some of their biases, that appeals to some of their preconceptions, and can warp them towards a good cause. I think that climate activism is one brilliant example of this, as I already talked about before. So how did something like that rise up, and how did we really gain an understanding of pathogens in general through the example of climate change? Well, I published, or I am going to publish actually, another episode that is strongly connected to this type of research, and quite frankly to many of the loose ends that I think still need to be found. So when we're talking about pathogens, the analogy is often not only just a comparison, but often literal as well. That they do behave much like viruses, much like pathogens, in that they have various vectors of spread, they have various characteristics that can be identified, and that should be the goal in understanding these. So what does climate activism teach us with regards to what kind of characteristics can we really narrow in on in order to make a successful pathogen that is based in reality? Well, first of all, there's vectors of transmission. There are three main categories that I'm going to settle into with regards to defining these. The first is spreading through corruption or through economic incentives. Essentially, there are types of pathogens that can gather a lot of political power, that can gather a lot of money, and can use that to condition people into supporting it even if they don't necessarily believe it. One great example is with regards to the election fraud conspiracy theories, the idea that there was such a vast amount of fraud that it could have flipped the election from Trump to Biden, which was pushed down with significant political capital from the highest office in the United States. Another method of spread is through vocal minorities. And here I mean minorities as in people who hold very unpopular political views, not necessarily people in a given demographic, and the unwillingness to act of larger institutions that contain these vocal groups. One great example are the racial conspiracies that have significant outsized influence in institutions such as American media and American universities due to a simple risk-reward calculation. If there's just a move to appease these vocal groups, then in the short term, at the very least, there isn't that much consequence to the administration, and they just make everyone else a little bit more annoyed, irritated, that they have to work with conspiracy theorists in the rest of their normal jobs. However, if they oppose said conspiracy theorists, then they'll be slandered as racist, they'll be slandered as all sorts of other things, harassed online, etc., creating a significant personal consequence for the people who are actually making the decision. So when you have that calculation, then they're not actually looking out for the long-term interest of the institution, and then can therefore spread regardless of whether an idea is actually good or not. The third is through psychological flaws, manipulation, as I talked about before, and this has been greatly amplified through something like social media. There's good data by Tristan Harris and the Center for Humane Technology on this, where various biases such as confirmation bias, negativity bias, narrative bias are boosted and preferred by social media algorithms. And this actually encompasses both of the conspiracy theories that we already talked about. Now, of course, as with every definition, as with every term, there's going to be a little bit of an error here. But that's fine. There's always going to be a little bit of an exception, and we can always bring that up. We can always talk about that, but generally these are the three categories. And then once you have this down, then we're going to look at the actual composition. So I've also identified, as of now, 4 main cultural phenomena that lead to successful pathologens. One is historical roots, a significant narrative of a given country, of a given place, of a given population. This in the United States can include American mythology, American exceptionalism, undying kind of worship of the Constitution. Of course, I don't have that much against the Constitution, but a worship of it is a bit much, etc. The second is a significant childhood event or raising, and this could generally be widespread, or it can be literally something that happens right away. Like one subcategory of this that I count as one of the 4 is symbolic experiences. For example, something like 9/11 or something like Vietnam, where even if people weren't directly affected from it, they were so kind of culturally impacted that they have a permanent appeal that can be made based on certain policy or moral lines. The second is just conditioning and upbringing, and I think here is one aspect where the climate change activism really got started. There was a dedicated effort to push through, and I think rightly, various statistics on climate change, various timelines into public education. But along with that came a group of activists, a group of people who made emotional appeals, a group of people who essentially tried to make it salient for 9 or 10-year-olds. But this created a long-term attachment, an emotional attachment, which I think is the fundamental base for the climate activism that we see today, and can be instruction if we can actually gain that much political power in order to actually affect this. And the fourth is popular culture, various embedded appeals, various moral priorities and assumptions that you might see in popular culture. And once you look at all of these, you can see that there are various individual things that we can leverage, mainly through social media, mainly through communication, mainly through any kind of contact we can have with some of these various areas to build local organizing, to build local communities, and to influence that change at a specific geographical level in order to essentially manufacture or to change the aesthetics of one of these 4 areas and create new cultural ley lines for the implementation of pathologens that are actually based in fact.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean that I find that fascinating. It's a lot to take in for sure. But I think there's a lot of very fundamental level kind of truth there or value to be taken from that approach and from laying out those 4 areas where that seem to be the most ripe for creating that change and instilling that much connection within the population. It sounds like that contributes plenty to the contagious aspects of the pathogen. And so it's kind of more, I guess, looking forward towards solutions. It's trying to figure out how to best craft narratives towards a goal that is, representative and best for everyone, regardless of how we identify politically. And how do we get those out and start them spreading? And I don't know, do you have just kind of the idea of very deliberate approach doing that, or almost like manufacturing these pathologens in a way of just, how would you imagine going about crafting those and disseminating them? And
Quite frankly, it requires boots on the ground. Not literally, but in terms of people actively crafting new ideas. Quite honestly, it's an art. It's an art form. People engaging with their own social media networks, trying to leverage those network effects, those exponential growths, and to gather research on what dynamics they see in their own subcommunities. Quite frankly, it's impossible for me, particularly in a country as large as the United States, because there are just so many subcommunities, so many geographic communities, etc., that I'm not going to understand all of them. I'm not going to understand why certain pathogens do well in certain zip codes and certain other ones do not. And that is up to my audience, and I hope many people in your audience who decide to look towards the same goals as well. But if you want a kind of sticky note guide to how to do this, you can check out the next Metapolitics episode. But number one would be to collect information about the connections between whether something is jumping from one area to another in terms of politics. For example, election fraud, jumping from the QAnon adjacent group to more mainstream Republicans. That was a major kind of transition point. And the other is those cultural ley lines that I already talked about before. What kind of appeals are being made in order to spread these conspiracy theories? What kind of emotions are being pushed around? What kind of tactics are being used? And to record all of those and to think about how they could be used in a way that does align with reality.
Great. I know we talked a little bit, or you had mentioned before, that some of the earlier Metapolitics podcast episodes were kind of trying to give advice and tips and tricks for how to kind of confront these things, or at least how to take them in or recognize them as as we're taking in, consuming media. That again, that system in and of itself, the institution of media, is losing trust, whether that's on any given side or not. It's the different institutions seem to be playing to their captured demographics more and more, and caring less and less about the whole population, I guess, or the general, in more general terms. And so once, I know you've talked about that on your show as well, the captured demographic and the dynamic that we face when the incentive structures within those institutions are only really targeting their captured demographics, and they want to aim to please the people who are already there. Is that something that you feel like there's a way out there? Is that if we can construct a new institution that is maybe creating and putting out effective pathogens that might represent a larger swath of the population, that might be able to, instead of aiming at captured demographics, because if you're starting something new, you don't really have much of a captured demographic, you're starting small, but you have a chance to potentially capture people's attention from their own kind of cultural sub-community, and maybe persuade them into something that is more broadly appealing.
Yeah, so to summarize that question, how do we rip the eyes of people away from CNN and away from Fox News and MSNBC? Well, quite frankly, I personally am a bit, and I think that I am more negative than I should be about the hope of a more generalized news network. And let me lay out kind of why I doubt myself. So my initial assessment of this is that the dominant idea will end up being people who appeal to these various subcommunities, who appeal to prior biases, and that there won't necessarily be that much of a contingent, or there won't be a majority contingent in the United States that makes those appeals. However, we have a very nice voting system, and I know people don't like the voting system, but it's actually nice in that it encourages moderation. If you have a set of people who will always vote one way and a set of people who will always vote the other, then the people who are actually being contested over is the center. And my kind of counterpoint to my own conjecture that the majority of people are going to be fixated on their own partisan divides, or on their own kind of even sub-partisan factional divides, what you're going to see in the center is a concentration of political power based on those internal groups. If there is an ability to kind of level the pathologen playing field, because then you're essentially going to have a weird sort of independentocracy, where the people who are actually free thinking, who actually do want to engage in various topics, are going to be the ones who are making the pathologens themselves, and that there's going to be a centralization in actually appealing those people in a very straightforward way, because if the odds are, if they're engaging in the game, they're not going to fall for the tricks of the game.
Yeah.
However, the question is how many people are actually in that center, and how likely is it that it doesn't end up being sort of an elite group, a cartel group, kind of like you have with regards to various top-ranking universities right now, albeit probably a little bit more sane. If you have essentially that small number of people, less than probably 0.1% of the population, or if you have a wider spread group. And personally, I think I'm a lot more pessimistic about whether that group will be large enough to matter, but quite frankly, I don't know for sure.
Yeah, and it almost seems like there is still the angle of just attempting to garner interest and influence with some of those ideas. And I think I'm just off the top of my head, I guess. I mean, obviously Trump was someone who came in from outside of the game, but I was also thinking like Andrew Yang seemed to kind of break in and just on the influence of the ideas alone kind of swept up a little bit of interest, and obviously now running for mayor of New York, which seems to put him in good position to potentially have some influence in changing the way at least politicians are viewed, or kind of riding that wave of being someone who's outside of the game and is playing the game in a different way. And I see him as a source of some of the concepts and ideas, whether he's the true source of them or if he's just kind of capitalizing on them. But as a generator of some of those pathologens, as you're saying, or even just kind of drawing the parallel with memifying kind of certain things that are going to be spreading virally, like throughout the culture. I think we've seen plenty of that already kind of taking root. So I think to maybe counteract some of the pessimism, we have a few examples, and obviously they're drastically different from each other, Trump and Yang, but we have seen that as a fairly successful attempt at coming into the game with a much different approach, and having some degree of success there.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at those two cases. Do you think that Trump is an escalation of narrative warfare or a de-escalation of narrative warfare?
I I don't know. I feel like his place came as a result of escalation. It's hard to say what the resulting effects now that now that he's in the rearview mirror, or at least the presidency is in the rearview mirror. He's still obviously a known quantity. It's hard to say. We've seen in the aftermath of January 6th, plenty of Republicans kind of coming out fairly strongly, condemning what happened there. But yeah, it's hard to say what will come of that long term in terms of how the narrative will shape itself moving forward, or be shaped moving forward. I don't know. What about you?
Well, I see Trump as someone who looked at the field of, or I shouldn't say this implying that much kind of active planning. I don't think there was much active planning.
Yeah.
But I see him as someone who entered a field of disconnected pathologens and tied them all together. And in that way, he was an escalation of narrative warfare, from what I see. He was someone who really didn't have that different of, or I shouldn't say, his appeal was definitely different, but it was kind of like Dragon Ball, where they connected, where someone's soul was kind of split into 5 pieces, and then they assemble, and that was the Republican Party, and you assemble them together, and you have someone who puts together the 5 pieces of narrative warfare, and then you end up with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
all of those kind of tropes of denying obvious things that happened, of trying to weasel out of things by not answering the question. These are common things that politicians do, but they're not willing to do it, or at the least previously, they were not willing to do it as explicitly. However, afterwards, after Trump, I don't think this is necessarily going to return to normal either. Yang is a much more curious case, and I think that he may be someone who's closer to wielding pathologens for good, but I would push back, and I know I have a lot of Yang Gang listeners in my audience, so please take this as kindly as possible. But there's this notion of Yang. There's this notion of Yang as someone who is very neutral, someone who is purely facts-based and a true moderate. And even Yang himself completely pushes back on this. Yang is someone who is incredibly motivated by moral appeals. He's incredibly motivated by that kind of kindness, by that kind of caring about people who are in the worst circumstances, that are very highly fundamentally lowercase L liberal, or fundamentally left-wing in a normal politics. However, I think the difference with Yang is that, one, he has limiting principles. He's not willing to be abjectly anti-factual like many of the other people when they're pushing for their ideologies. And the mere insistence on playing on essentially telling, or I shouldn't say telling the truth specifically, but on avoiding completely explicit lies, that at least gives the appeal of a centrist, or that he's also willing to listen to people, that he's willing to interact with people without playing association games, without by default demonizing his opponents. That also gives the appeal of a moderate. But he's also someone who fundamentally, I think, if he took a political compass test, or if he took a moral foundations test, would end up looking like someone who is not even just slightly to the left, but significantly to the left.
Yeah.
So
well, I was going to say too, some of that appeal, I think, goes back to your previous point of the period of kind of radical decoherence that has been the case, and both of them, Trump and Yang, I think, have appeal that crosses what we would traditionally, has the potential to cross traditional party lines, as they've normally been, or what we've been used to. And I think that comes from the level of decoherence and them finding a way to thread that needle and kind of connect a few different things that are fractured and broken, and appealing to those people where the mainstream or the kind of status quo of the parties of either party were leaving these fractured, unrepresented folks behind.
Well, I think the core notion here is that the parties themselves are incredibly, incredibly stupid. Not necessarily any of the individuals involved in them. I don't know about that for sure. But collectively, as an entity, the parties are incredibly stupid and incredibly unself-aware. So, Yang and Trump are both not really competing with much, and Yang lost.
Yeah.
With regards to Trump, as I talked about before, he's the Dragon Ball Z, or he's the Exodia of narrative warfare. He's able to connect all of these different tools together. And I don't think he's any more coherent than the average Republican, or I think he's even less coherent than the average Republican, kind of appealing to every wing simultaneously and just stringing it all together with enough bluster or enough personality, if you can call it that. There's often not two policies you can name that really go together as a unit, right? You have his like libertarian but also very corrupt corporate handouty tax cuts. You have his opposition to war, which was actually popular, which was actually not really in alignment with the people who supported the tax cuts, since those people tended to be very pro-war. You had a significant appeal to even a little bit of drug decriminalization and criminal justice reform, and then of course you had at the same time very aggressive immigration policing, restrictions of those kinds on both legal and illegal immigrants. So you don't really get a bundle out of Trump at any given point in time, ever. He is sort of peak incoherence. And I think there's something to be said about why that did so well in the Republican Party. And I don't think this is exclusive to the Republican Party either. I think you can have a peak incoherence candidate in the Democratic Party if you get someone with enough kind of raw bluster like Trump. But to the broader point of whether this is... Actually, let's do Yang next. So, with regards to Yang, I think in an ideal world, if there was a world where coherence could be back, at least in the short term, Yang could have been that candidate. Who, see, this is me winning back all of the Yang Gang people again. I'm joking. But yeah, I think that Yang could definitely be, especially compared to the field. Like, the bar is so low here that just having those strong moral appeals, being willing to make them with some sort of factual tie-in, being willing to not demonize people based on party, and I think many of those people who Yang appealed to were either kind of Trump Republicans, working class Republicans, or they were people who fundamentally maybe had liberal kind of aspects in the first place. People who were maybe on the free speech crowd, who were maybe in the IDW crowd, who really are supposed to be liberals in any kind of normal democracy, people on the left in any kind of normal democracy that aligns with those moral values. So yes, I see a possibility that Yang could be that figure, but he lost to... I mean, there are various reasons why he lost, but also the barriers that are in the way, including corruption, including the ability of narrative warfare that exists right now, is just strong enough that I don't think that... I don't know. I think you can run the simulation 100 times and Yang wouldn't win the primary in any of them.
Yeah. I had my own kind of pet theory during the primaries when the media kind of put up the graphic that was saying with whoever your candidate that you were supporting, if they didn't win the Democratic primary, would you vote for whoever did win the Democratic primary? And Yang's numbers in that poll were strong support for him, but that didn't map onto if he lost, we would automatically vote. His numbers for people who wouldn't vote for the Democrat nominee should Yang not make it was much higher than everyone else, and that was kind of blown into just a major kind of point to make against him. And my theory there was that he's actually probably pulling a lot of the people who are supporting him would otherwise be Trump voting. And again, that's just speculation, but I think appealing to some of that fractured populace, and yeah, I don't think I was necessarily making the point that either of them was restoring coherence, but more capitalizing on the state that things are in of such after the point of such strong decoherence of being able to kind of pick and choose or tell a story that might otherwise not fit a party line narrative and capture some of those people who were left out or otherwise forgotten. So that just again was like, wanted to introduce, that was my theory back during the primary.
I see a lot of light in that.
Yeah.
I think I remember seeing a poll. I don't remember what source it was, and I might be wrong here, but that stated that Yang's numbers after he dropped out was about 30% voting for Trump, 30% just sitting out, not voting at all, and 40% voting for the Democratic nominee. And this was before an endorsement and before it was essentially right after he dropped out, so right after New Hampshire, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that absolutely checks out with your model. With regards to capitalizing on this politically, I think it's a very interesting question because ultimately, especially on the Democratic side, I think it's just a very incredibly difficult task. Because of the ideological incoherence on both ends, there's an enormous amount of power vested in the media. And there's significant, even compared to the Republicans, which I think is actually still significant, but even compared to that, the dominating force of media in deciding the 2020 primary, I think, wasn't even close compared to Trump, who got through. But on that end, I think you have an ability to manipulate emotional conjugations, to frame stories in a way that's most appealing to a given audience. And literally you can have the exact same phrasing, you can have different phrasings for the exact same policy and they would have different outcomes. For example, how people ask questions about Medicare for all, for example, Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act. And so the media actually has a lot of power in how they cover these stories because you will get these differing effects. Yeah. And I do absolutely think that almost all, or we can answer this as a question later afterwards, but I'm just going to state without evidence for now that if there was serious attention paid by regulatory agencies for journalism in foreign countries, that almost all of the American media outlets would be considered disinformation. But going on also to the Republican side, I think that Trump actually had a fair amount of media assistance on the Republican side, and that once again, that was the kind of leveraging factor. That the factor ultimately ended up with partially what moral values or kind of cultural ley lines you can appeal to, yes, but also a significant power that rested in the hands of media, that rested in the hands of their emotional framings and those conjugations. And that's why I'm actually somewhat pessimistic about the ability for insurgent candidates to emerge. And especially since the kind of new networks that do form, for example, with the Young Turks on the left, or what was Ben Shapiro's network on the right?
Daily
Wire. Yes. Those types of networks aren't necessary. Are like, I don't know. They're slightly stronger in terms of appealing to fundamental conservative or fundamental liberal moral values, but they don't necessarily ease up on the emotional warfare either. So, in short, I guess I don't see a world where the political capitalization really depends on taking it into a new direction. I think the Trump model of taking advantage of it politically is going to be the dominant one, which is that you look at all of these assumptions, you look at all of these cultural ley lines, and then you just kind of assemble them together in a way that balances the media and that balances people's preconceived notions, and that's how you're going to win going forward.
Yeah. And keep just, you're juggling essentially, like you said, 4 or 5 different non-coherent coalitions, and you're just kind of bouncing, in his case, just blustering around from one to the other so fast that it's impossible to really hold him to the fire at any one point. And it was, exhausting, and also just kind of, to the extent that you're able to detach from it, just watching it happen was kind of just inducing or inspiring, not necessarily in a good way or a positive way, but it was just, there was something about it that just was hard to really fathom that it was working. But it seemed to, and I would reflect your sentiment or idea that we're just going to continue to get more examples of that same or a similar model moving forward, because it worked, and having the strong emotional appeals, the moral appeals, if we can find the right people to kind of charismatically do that, or at least do that to where they can command the media that surrounds them and kind of carries them, lets them kind of be the wind under their wings, so to speak. It's a recipe that he proved worked, and unless we address the underlying issues of how the media is reporting this and willing to engage, then I would imagine more of the same is in store.
Yeah, the only pushback I have to that is that I don't think what Trump did was easy at all. And this is where I think gets to the best description of him, which is that, and this is not my idea, but many people has described him as a prodigy. And I think this is most apt, because if you consider, especially people who are very young age, maybe 6 years old, 7 years old, who are absolutely brilliant at a musical instrument, they often can't necessarily explain what patterns they're using. They don't have that kind of in-depth articulation. They just have some sort of intuitive sense of it. And I think that's exactly what Donald Trump brought to the table, in terms of being able to kind of sense those lines, being a stand-up comedian, understanding his crowd, right?
Yeah.
But not necessarily in a way that's translatable in any form. And I think you can see this almost explicitly with the failures of people like Josh Hawley to appeal to the kind of Trump base, or to appeal in any given way that actually builds the same type of loyalty, that builds the same sort of branding. And of course, you can argue that Trump was the first. He still holds the power. He's still the president, or he was still the president at that time when Hawley was making those appeals, etc. But I mean, just look at the two and you can see the difference immediately, but you can't really say what exactly that difference is either. And I think that enigma will be something that people really question and think about, and especially in the near-term political future. I actually think even comparing my understanding of it from the beginning to now, from the beginning as in maybe 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, I guess, I would say that it feels very much like listening to jazz music as someone who doesn't know jazz, and then listening to jazz music as someone who does know jazz. As someone who understands, or who gets the fundamentals of it at the very least, of someone who's able to say, oh, I see what you did there, but like, why? Why did that work?
Yeah.
But I see, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think even just like honing in on that specific thing, that specific point of being willing to look and kind of study it, it might not, I mean, it's most of the coverage, especially from the left, was more, it seemed like they were more concerned with focusing on the outrage of all of it, as opposed to maybe attempting to try to learn the language or figure out what was undergirding some of that. Because it, like you said, within that, you said prodigy. I was almost thinking like savant is also kind of in the same field, where it's like we don't necessarily understand this, but I thought that was an important thing to try to do, to try to put the pieces together in a way that might be able to generate a model that could be used and aimed towards different purposes, but still capitalize on the same energy that was underlying it.
Yeah, I think with regards to Trumpology, I think there are people who are going to get degrees in that, or people who are going to be experts in that for sure. I mean, you had Maggie Haberman, for example, essentially being a dedicated kind of Trump analyst for the New York Times. And honestly, I think that some of her work wasn't bad either. As an aside, this is something that people need to get right about media in general, is that you can have functioning people in even extremely corrupt institutions. You can still have very functional people. And a mistake that people make as well, particularly hardcore partisans, although I hope many people don't belong to that group who are listening to this podcast, but also
unless
I think
we're
some
winning them over. But yeah, we'll leave that to this. Yeah,
and well, I just hope people don't do this in general, but who play association games with media and who are really, and I think there are people who are really willing to go to extremely far and not just nonsensical, but delusional or even more than that extents of catastrophic extents. And one good example of this was with regards to one of the videos Project Veritas published with regards to some CNN internal communications. And you had people who are professional journalists calling it a deepfake. And I think they either don't understand that word or that they don't understand, and actually I'm certain they don't understand the technology behind it. Because if that video was actually a deepfake with regards to the accuracy and the kind of pristineness of the entire thing, it would mean that Project Veritas has better like frontier level information warfare software than Google, than Facebook, than the American government, than any foreign government.
Yeah.
So maybe
I missed that specific thing. Is there? I mean, could you give a quick little like summary of?
Oh, sorry. I wrote a Substack article on this. Cactus.substack.com for those who are interested. Although that's dead for now. I'll bring it back. But with regards to deepfakes, essentially they're an artificially generated video, typically done by artificial intelligence, that essentially modifies some aspect of the video in a seamless way. So in a way that's undetectable by the human eye. And that's what we call a deepfake.
And with the specific Project Veritas example, what was the situation there?
I think it was leaked communications of a Zoom call of a CNN meeting or something like that.
Gotcha.
And it was pristine. But in order to, there's no kind of publicly available even demonstration of an algorithm that is that high quality. If it was fake, I think that there is essentially 0% chance that was fake.
Yeah.
Because of that extremely high technological requirement. But we had people who, at the very least, considered themselves experts, who I think they were self-aware that they had no idea about the actual technology involved, but they were willing to wield those absolute delusional claims. And what the fundamental basis of this is actually a kind of I don't want to say moral absolutism. I don't think that's the right word, but an association game that's played. That's the word that I use for this. An association game that's played where they say anything that my enemy does has to be false. Not just that I don't trust them, because it's okay not to trust people.
Totally.
To say, if my enemy says this, then I don't know if it's true or not. And I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to take it for granted. But no, this is completely taking this to another level and saying anything that my enemy says is not only untrustworthy, but explicitly false. I believe exactly the opposite just because they said that. And you saw a lot of this in the Trump election fraud claims as well. Oh, they declared victory for Biden? Well, since they're the enemy, that means that Trump won. And of course, this is confirming their biases. But this argument is becoming increasingly accepted, not just on these conspiratorial fringes, but also on people who consider themselves centrist, who consider themselves mainstream. And I think there was this New York Times article that was something along the lines of critical thinking is not good, or something like that, where they essentially suggested that you should exclusively judge characteristic by these various association games, by saying like, oh, you should research the source, and if the source is not good, then you should believe it, or you shouldn't believe it, regardless of what the claim actually is. And of course, if you actually, this obviously, first of all, gives a ton of false positives. You have many sources, for example, that may have, even in general, parts that function well, and then have absolutely delusional staff members as well, as we talked about earlier with regards to institutional corruption. And on the flip side, you have active smear campaigns constantly going on. You had one against Unity 2020 itself. And because of that, much of this narrative warfare is being weaponized aggressively. They're weaponized for offense with regards to, it's incredibly difficult to get people to trust you, but it's incredibly easy to get people not to trust you, or not to trust someone else.
Right. And the degree of I mean, it jumps just from the, like you were saying, questioning or saying, I don't trust this source based on the association I have with it, but jumping from there to absolute certainty that it's incorrect, And I mean, that even wraps back into the conspiratorial ideas and those ideas that are spreading. Again, that's what I was saying. Like, it's not necessary to completely jump to the absolute and say that is not true at all. You can start by saying, I recognize that actually there may be some truth to that, but it's maybe less rampant of an issue, or maybe there's too much of a focus. But using the association to just give yourself absolute certainty really helps no one.
I think this really strikes at the core of what sense making is. And what sense making is it's a trade. It's a trade from between certainty and power, where you trade the comprehension of an idea for the ability to use that idea everywhere, right? So, for example, taking the idea that the vaccines work. Of course, there's a very high likelihood that the vaccines work, probably between 90 to 100% chance that they work. However, that they're likely not going to have side effects for the majority of people as well, from what we have preliminarily. But, of course, having that idea is not the same as having the idea that vaccines always work, that we're 100% sure of it.
Mm-hmm.
However, making that leap gives you the power to administrate it on a large level, for example, avoiding legal liability. And in my opinion, at least, that's something that should absolutely be done right now. That should be done in a way that is very trustworthy, even if that there's an understanding that for maybe 3-4% of people, there's going to be slight side effects. Not death, not anything crazy, not anything worse than the coronavirus, but slight irritation, fever, etc.
When you're saying that should be done right now, do you mean like giving credence to some of the can you flesh that out a little bit more? You were saying
it should be widespread administered. It should be administered in a widespread way.
Okay, but as far as
and we should treat it even if it doesn't have that 100% certainty, we should treat it as if it does for the actual administration, for the actual kind of process of distributing it.
Okay, even with the information surrounding it, is that what you're suggesting? Like with the communication surrounding the rollout of it, putting our I guess, yeah. Are you saying that we should not leave room for communicating any sort of doubt or question of that maybe like 5%?
Oh, okay. I see the question now. Okay, this is an actually very nuanced point in my opinion, and I'm not 100% sure of my take on this. But my take on this is that and this is something that I think I highly disagree with many people in the kind of center or third way circle, is that there are a lot of people who make irrational decisions, and there are a lot of people who are absolutely kind of irrationally risk sensitive. And ideally, you should be able to say, look, here are the possibilities, here's the risk, here's the calculation, and have people understand that it's something that is beneficial to them, that they have to do this in order to avoid actually getting the coronavirus. But if you have that small amount of uncertainty in people, there are psychological flaws that will lead them to catastrophizing, and that will lead them to possibly
that uncertainty could build into
and especially with what we have now, create scenarios where we don't reach herd immunity, and that there are actual significant consequences, particularly to those who are not able to get it because of various medical conditions, and who would strongly benefit from herd immunity. However, I don't know. I certainly don't think that means that the current regime of kind of absolute enforcement of party line is okay either. Particularly, I don't think that there should be long-term consequences for people who dissent and people who just say something that is correct. Which is a contradiction, but I think it's a contradiction that buys us more good in terms of keeping people who deserve their spots in their spots, while also mitigating some of the irrational risk, while also leveraging some of these possibly malicious tools for a positive end. And I'm completely welcome to criticism on this. I'm not 100% sure on this as well. And I'm welcome of criticism for basically anything I say, but especially this.
Yeah,
this is not something that's like nailed down.
Yeah, I think, just from my own intuitions, it's slightly different. I understand like the overall benefit of that, but I think if anything, I might think that you may be underestimating the kind of, I don't know, I always describe it as kind of like an allergy that I feel like I'm very allergic to the level of certainty that's put out. And if someone claims to be absolutely sure of something, it's almost impossible for me to back that up. So I think that in terms of this, maybe goes back to the trust element, that I think you can actually build a lot more trust by leaving that little bit of margin of error or that wiggle room that, this might have some negative consequences for some people, but the more clearly you can spell that out, the less allergic, for using my term again, that I will be, because I will understand that you are not treating me, you're treating me with respect and understanding that you're being as truthful and as clear about that, about the risks associated with it as can be, as opposed to just saying, well, we need to protect everyone, so we should claim that it's absolute, so that more people will do that. And I think there's truth there, or potential truth there, of what you're saying, that I think it might have more of an effect on people who otherwise would let that risk, or that sensitivity to risk, run a little bit more rampant within themselves if they were given even just a tiny bit of reason to doubt the efficacy. But I think there's a similar side effect of offering certainty where there's not certainty there, that I think for me that creates a similar seed of doubt, or just underlying trust in general in the authorities that are disseminating that information.
Yeah, so this is a criticism, or not necessarily criticism, but an argument that I hear a lot, particularly from the kind of free-thinking group of people. And I quite frankly, I think you're a smart, independent person who surrounds himself with smart, independent people, and as such, you highly overestimate the number of smart, independent people in the world.
That very well may be.
I absolutely think that there's a set of people who are affected by this. And not only that, it's a set of people who are incredibly valuable. And that's what I talked about with regards to not necessarily harshly punishing those people who dissent. But I think if you look at the calculation overall, there is some data for this. I think there was some sort of reference to this. It was not a direct comparison of people who value like free thinking, but people who value individual liberty and people who value free thinking is actually a relatively rare trait compared to neuroticism, compared to catastrophizing. This was in the book, I forgot the title, but it was the book that coined the term WEIRD, the acronym WEIRD, for white, educated, industrialized something democracy. It was a very good book as well. But yeah, I think ultimately if you plug in so there's two kind of arguments to this. There's the kind of like utilitarian argument, and then there's the kind of deontological argument. And the utilitarian argument, which is what I take, particularly in the time of COVID, is that there are just so many more people who would have that kind of doubt in their mind that would lead to them not getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't actually question the kind of absolute enforcement of it, and not that many dissenters.
Yeah.
And the problem here is that the dissenters are right. But yeah.
It does. They're right in a certain sense. Like I
like on the facts, they're right. Like they're just saying like, or at least the category of dissenters that we're talking about are literally people who are just pointing out the actual statistics.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try to see if we can come to a synthesis here, because there's probably some way to resolve this in a better way. There are always some contradictions you have to live with, and maybe the goal here is to leave it as in kind of Easter egg, a piece of information to say, well, if you found it, then congratulations. Here's you're in on the joke now, and make that like a pretty hard thing to find informationally, but that is possible to find, so that people know they're not being gaslit, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think there are too many journalists who do too well of a job for that to stay hidden.
Fair. Even with the institutions crumbling, there, like you're saying, there are still.
Yeah, I think Glenn Greenwald's Substack is going to get that covered.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's not. In an ideal world, that might be the state that I try to leave it in, but I don't think that has any sort of kind of stable equilibrium there.
Yeah, and I think, like you're saying too, it's like if you take into account the numbers that it would take to reach herd immunity, and had some way of kind of calculating or estimating the number of people that, how we were saying here, are more sensitive to the risk and the possibility of any question being left as to the effectiveness of the vaccines, that would go a long way for me to just bite my lip, bite my tongue, and it's and that's, again, personally, it's not even necessarily that I would be out loud and vocal it wouldn't be in my interest to go out and make that my hill to die on, so to speak. So it's like there is an understanding totally that like from the utilitarian side and that perspective, it makes more sense to quell any doubts and sensitivity towards that uncertainty in the hopes that enough people would do that so that we could reach herd immunity and start building the new the new normal, whatever that's going to be.
A thing that also has to be mentioned is that this can't be abused. And in the United States, it absolutely has been abused, where it's not only been used for political purposes, but it's also been completely used in a way that has become ineffective. And I think this is something that's huge in contributing towards poor management of the coronavirus. Is that in other countries, you kind of have the ability for political leaders of either party to just come and to ask people to do things nicely, particularly in times of crisis, and
lead.
That a much higher level of compliance will be achieved just by doing that.
Yeah.
For example, there weren't necessarily hard line restrictions in Canada for a long time. Well, they were eventually put into place, and there were some at the local level as well. But there were very differing rates of infection at the early stages, just because more people complied with the suggestions, with the and even now, when there are full-in restrictions in place, I think there's generally a higher level of compliance. Actually, I don't have numbers for this, but I think if it's similar to levels earlier in the year, that there's higher levels of compliance in other Western countries compared to the United States.
Yeah, I would say that's a fairly low bar to be. Yeah, I don't think the United States level of compliance is too difficult to beat. I think that's the point you're kind of getting at.
Yeah, and this isn't a trivial thing. Like, many people in the United States take it for granted that there's just a strain of libertarianism, but this really arose after the kind of Reagan movement. And yes, it did play off some of the foundations of independence, but independence never meant don't trust your neighbor, don't trust officials when they ask you to do something nicely. It meant don't give them tyrannical power. But it slowly shifted towards the latter as there was more media manipulation and as there was a strain of radical libertarianism, extreme individualism that explicitly sought to kind of devalue government in the eyes of people, even parts of government that weren't necessarily kind of authoritarian or dictatorial in any actual way. And I mean, the question, this is an open question. It's not something that I've thought too much about to how public trust ended in the state of affairs. I mean, I would assume that greater power of disinformation and also just spending of institutional trust leading up to this, and just the repeated mistakes, WMDs and claiming to have WMDs in Iraq, for example, repeated mistakes year after year. I'm just shocked that no one noticed this and no government official said, look, we have a crisis of institutional legitimacy and we need to fix this now or terrible things will happen. And yeah, I'm just shocked. I mean, I can come up with several hypotheses as to why. Increasing concentration of moneyed interests, partisan decoherence, as I talked about before. But this is just something that's so obvious. It's the boy who cried wolf. If you keep abusing these powers, then you won't have them at the time when you need them the most. And I think that's exactly what has just transpired with the coronavirus.
Yeah, among other things. And I don't know, that might be a good point to kind of tie it back all in. And again, obviously, like, we're here through, like, this podcast is doing stuff because of the Unity movement, which, like we said before, not only recognized the state that we're in, but sought to try to explore a new way to deal with it and tackle that problem. Because, like you're saying, however many hypotheses you want to come up with, it regardless of what those hypotheses are, like, we're still in that position. and it's helpful that we need to be having those conversations and attempting to try and glean what brought us here in order to hopefully overturn those or come up with solutions to replace the trends that have brought us to where we are. I don't know. It's hard to say, but I guess the unity movement as a whole for us, it seems like most of us understood that it was a long shot. That's understating it, but there just seems to be the energy that kind of motivated most of the movement was an energy that was understanding that nothing would happen if we didn't address it and start trying to formulate ways out of it.
So here's my note of optimism for both Unity and for the United States and world at large, which is that there's a nested hostage situation. Right now, there's a hostage-taking attempt by political forces of various other groups who don't necessarily have that political power right now. And Unity is trying to get out of that. But this is actually nested inside of another hostage situation where reality is going to fall apart if these people don't actually get their act together. And that there's only so much rope that's left until we're all left hanging. Now, this isn't to say that the collapse of the United States is impossible. This isn't to say that there's no world where we run out of rope. However, this is to say that we have an incredibly strong threat to use against these corrupt political actors. And that this threat isn't even initiated by us. We can just point at it. And there's going to be no kind of harm, or there's going to be no animus in us doing so. So what this means is that there's going to be always, I think, a majority of people who are driven by these pathologens, who are driven by these emotional connections, and maybe they'll realign into normal ideologies once again. However, I think that there's going to be a continued understanding by those who care, by those who have the resources, but also those who have the understanding, who have the scientific advantage to manipulate these pathologens, to drive narratives in ways that are in alignment with reality, and to be much more stable and much more responsible with that than anything we've done in the past. And if those people are willing to get together, and they're willing to organize, and they're willing to work day and night in actually accomplishing this task, then I think that there will be a way out.
Yeah. The way you started it there, I was waiting for the optimistic take to appear, and it finally did. I think even just simplifying it down to recognizing maybe the potential for a new coalition to form that is almost entirely made up of people who are pointing at the thing, and that alone is the kind of the community aspect, or that's where the coalition is drawn around. We all team up regardless of the political leanings that we might espouse individually, but if we are all, if we all recognize that there is something threatening us, and that threat right now is more imminent than it really has ever been, the fact that we're all pointing towards that and recognizing that we need to address it and try to conquer that, or that seems to be a potential to create a new coalition that brings more people together than we're used to with such a divided kind of narrative focus within specifically the United States.
Yeah, I think that there will always be, or I think that it will always be a minority of people who really understand the stakes, who really understand what we're dealing with, and the tools and the cards that are all on the table. But I think that group of people will have the ability to, for at the very least, a long time after this, architect a world where people understand the consequences, not necessarily computationally or rationally, but that we establish a new cultural ley line that enshrines these values. And
Definitely.
To the extent that Unity is doing that, to the extent that Unity is doing a job towards pushing towards any kind of better future, I'm very thankful for all of you.
Yeah. Well, and I've, like I said, I've personally taken the time to kind of dive through and listen to. I think I might be all caught up, with the exception of the interview that you've had so far. But from my own personal experience, it's, again, we're happy to have you on just to amplify your podcast, Metapolitics. So if you're listening to this and have enjoyed this conversation at all, I will say Cactus makes each episode much more succinct, and for me it's been clear and concise and helpful, and I just find that you not only pick and choose the issues or the ideas and trends and patterns to focus on, but do a very excellent job at explaining them and offering ideas and solutions. So again, like, highly recommending checking out Metapolitics, and we're hoping that this conversation we've just had will bring you a wider audience, because I think you're doing important work, and as much as we can help with that, and you're helping with us as well, it's having your mind on here to kind of go over things and shoot the breeze, I guess, has been helpful and informative, and for me it's been a lot of fun. So we appreciate you taking the time to come on, and hopefully our listeners will enjoy and find plenty to work with and to bite off and seek you out further to help kind of build the resistance, I guess.
Yeah, that term has not ended up in a great place, but
No.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be on. I'm thrilled with the message of Unity, and if you're someone who's interested in going deeper into getting these guidelines, into actually doing that sort of impromptu research, and in understanding the world around you and seeking those hidden traits that kind of unravel the irrationality, then check out the Metapolitics podcast, META space politics, on any podcast network. Once again, thank you so much for having me on, and I hope that you see brilliant successes in the future with Unity and with the podcast too.
Likewise. Thanks again, Cactus. And thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again next week. It's been Unity Now. I'm Gabe Garber. Thanks.
To find more conversations and content like this, be sure to subscribe to Unity Now on all major podcasting platforms. If you prefer video format, you'll find our channel with full episodes and clips on YouTube. Bye.